Mr. King, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate this hearing, and I'm curious about a number of things here, and I'm resisting for the moment the urge to start off on a monologue, but I'd instead turn my first question to Mr. Gibson. And you talked about the share of the market that you could gain if we could open up trade with Cuba, or at least open up some credit with Cuba. And you say Cuba has imported zero wheat or rice from the U.S. in I think the last 4 years or so, something like that. And so I wanted to ask you about your concept of the market, and that is that then who's selling that rice to Cuba, and where is your product going? Are people going to, the real question is this, are Cubans going to eat more if we trade with them? Or do we have an alternative market that our products go to regardless of whether it's easy to export to Cuba because of the cash restrictions up front?
Well, to answer the first part of your question, people are going to eat. The real question is, how much do they have to pay for the product? So in the current environment...
But I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in, are they going to eat more or less? Does that affect their diet? Or is the overall world market going to be to the appetite of what people can afford? And then it's just a difference in the logistics of what the basis is between shipping rice to Cuba and selling it to an alternative market somewhere, say, for example, Vietnam.
Competition will always lower prices.
Yeah.
So when people have more money, they eat more.
Okay, well, slightly more. I don't think you have any numbers on that. And so I just take it to this point that in the business I'm in, we want to see more construction projects out there because we've got a bigger market to bid into. And I think this is a tiny little margin. It's 11 million people on a little island out of 7 billion people on the planet. So we could divide 11 million by 7 billion and come up with a percentage of appetites that would be potentially affected by this. I'm just putting that into a perspective because I think we're very narrow vision on this. And I'm like a number of people in this room. I've made my trip to Cuba, and I ended up spending nearly a week with an individual who I better not identify him because he would be busted by the Castro administration. But I paid him cash to travel me around from early in the morning till late at night. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot that you don't learn when you're following Castro's minders around Cuba. And some of these things are this, milestones about history that we ought to be thinking about in this 50-year-plus saga of trying to free the Cuban people, back when we believed in promoting freedom around the world, and we will again. First place is the Soviet Union propped Cuba up, and Cuba was a sugar-promoting island at the time. The world market on sugar then was 6 cents a pound, and the Soviet Union traded them 51 cents worth of oil for 6 cents of sugar. That's how they propped that regime up through all of that time until the Soviet Union collapsed economically, and then Venezuela picked up the slack. Oh, by the way, those Russian tractors are probably still sitting down there rusting, and they've been parked for parts, and now we have the only civilized country in the world that I know of that went from a mechanized agriculture to animal husbandry, went backwards instead of forwards. Now there's 1 billion feet of rope in Cuba to tie down their animals that they used to farm with. But Venezuela filled that hole. And when Venezuela goes under, then the President of the United States decides I'm going to open up negotiations or relations with Cuba. And now we're in the business of negotiating here on how we might open up trade with Cuba to try to help their economy out and help the Cuban people. And I heard Ms. Lowe say that we wanted to keep the money out of the hands of the Castro regime. And I hear Mr. Claver-Caron say, well, every trade agreement for the last 50 years has been exactly with the Castro regime. And so it looks to me that the President of the United States is interested in bridging this administration over and giving help to the transition from the Castro administration to the successor, which we've talked about. And this whole policy has been about the biological solution in Cuba that has to come one day, and it is more imminent every single day. And that is, Castro's lived a lot longer than we anticipated that he would. And I don't know that this administration has a plan to transition and promote freedom in Cuba. I suspect they don't, because it looks like to me that they have a plan to prop up the Marxist regime. And I don't want to curse the Cuban people to the next 11 million Cuban people to the next 50 years of living under a Marxist regime. And then the money laundering that goes on in Cuba, it was 21 pesos to the U.S. dollar when I was there. It's 23.14 pesos now. Cubans can earn American dollars, they can hold them, but they can't spend them. They have to go to a Cuban bank where they get $1 for they get $1 for every 23.14 pesos, and so the Castro picks up They get 1 peso for every dollar, and Castro picks up 22 pesos out of that. He gets the vigorish. That props up the Cuban administration. Castro runs the hotels. American dollars go into the pockets of the Castro regime. This big picture part of this thing has not been addressed in this hearing in an adequate way. I recognize the testimony of Mr. Claver-Carone, and I think that we have much more we need to discuss before we move forward with something that would facilitate a Marxist regime in Cuba. Thank you. I yield back.